Welcome to our deep dive today. It's going to be a fascinating one. We're going to be talking about the divided brain. Have you ever felt like you have two completely different modes of thinking in your head?
Right.
That's what we're going to be unpacking today, this whole concept of brain lateralization. The idea that the two hemispheres of your brain
Right.
specialize in completely different ways of processing the world.
It's really fascinating. It's not just about,
Yeah.
the sort of left brain versus right brain.
Yeah.
What's really intriguing is how these, kind of subtle differences can have a huge impact on everything from how we perceive the world to even how entire cultures develop, as we'll see.
Wow. Okay. So to guide us on this journey, we're going to be focusing mainly on a book by Iain McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary. Don't worry, if that title sounds a little intimidating, we will be your guides navigating all of his complex ideas.
It's a really good book.
And trust me, this is a journey you will not want to miss.
He beautifully weaves together neuroscience, philosophy, and cultural history to make this really compelling case for how the two hemispheres have shaped not only individual perception, but like I said,
Yeah.
the entire course
Yeah.
of Western civilization.
Let's jump into this. Our first stop is the two hemispheres, two different worlds. So what are the core differences in how they approach the world?
Well, imagine you're standing in front of a really sprawling landscape. Your left hemisphere, it's kind of like a zoom lens. It's focusing on the specifics, like the details and labeling and categorizing everything it sees. It's creating a map, and it's trying to make sense of the world by breaking it down into manageable pieces. This hemisphere, it thrives on familiarity, predictability, and it always seeks control.
So it's the hemisphere that helps us use language, solve logic problems, follow instructions, all those left-brained things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you have the right hemisphere, which is more like a wide-angle lens. It takes in the entire landscape
Yeah.
at once. It sees the big picture, the interconnectedness of everything, and experiences the world directly without the need to dissect and label. So
I think it's wild to think that even if the connection between these two hemispheres, the corpus callosum, is severed, that people can still function relatively normally. It's like
Yeah.
we have these two distinct processors running in parallel, creating the seamless experience of reality.
It really challenges the notion of a unified self,
Yeah.
doesn't it? And here's where it gets even more interesting. The right hemisphere is where we find those things that make us uniquely human.
Yeah.
Things like metaphor, humor, irony, an intuitive understanding. That goes beyond words. Think about those times when you felt a deep connection with a piece of music, but you couldn't quite explain why.
Or like that gut feeling you get about someone, even though you've just met them. Is that the right hemisphere at work too?
Precisely. It's the master of meaning, the interpreter of emotions, the connector of the dots.
Yeah.
But, as we'll see, the left hemisphere, despite its limitations, has a tendency to, well, let's just say,
Yeah.
it likes to be in charge.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll have to come back after the break to discuss that a little bit more. But stay tuned, because this is going to be good.
It is. It's going to be great.
So we've got these two distinct ways of thinking, almost like two personalities sharing a brain. But you mentioned that the left hemisphere has a tendency to want to take charge. Isn't that a good thing? I mean, we need logic and structure to function in the world, right?
Oh, absolutely. The left hemisphere's gifts are undeniable. It's
Yeah.
the architect of our civilizations,
Yeah.
the builder of our technologies. But as McGilchrist argues, there's a potential dark side to its dominance. It's a bit like a brilliant but overzealous apprentice who, left unchecked, might just take over the workshop.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So our second point of discussion, the left hemisphere, power and illusion. What are we talking about here? How can logic and structure be a bad thing?
Well, think about it this way. The left hemisphere craves certainty. It wants to fit everything into neat categories to explain the world through logic and language. But the real world is messy, full of contradictions and ambiguities. The left brain deals with this by creating narratives, models, and systems, all very useful tools, but they can become a trap.
You're saying that the left hemisphere can get so attached to its own models that it starts to ignore anything that doesn't fit.
Exactly. McGilchrist points to some fascinating research that shows the left hemisphere actually prefers to believe information from authority figures, even when its own sensory experience contradicts that information. Pretty sobering, right?
That is kind of scary when you think about how much we rely on experts and authorities to shape our understanding of the world. But doesn't the right hemisphere balance this out?
It certainly tries to, but here's where the concept of necessary ignorance comes in. McGilchrist argues that for the brain to function effectively, Each hemisphere needs to be somewhat blind to what the other is doing. Imagine it like a dance partnership. Each dancer needs a sense of the other's movement. But if they try to micromanage each other's steps, the whole dance falls apart.
So there's a delicate tension between the two hemispheres, a need for both integration and separation.
Precisely. Now, this isn't to say that the left hemisphere is the villain of the story. It's more about recognizing its limitations and ensuring that the right hemisphere's wisdom isn't completely drowned out.
This all leads us to our next discussion point, the rise of the left hemisphere in Western culture. I have a feeling this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable. McGilchrist connects these brain hemispheres to historical trends. Tell me more about this connection.
Yeah, he argues that the left hemisphere's way of thinking has become increasingly dominant in Western culture, particularly over the last few centuries. Think about historical developments like the invention of writing, the rise of currency, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. All of these emphasized abstraction analysis and control. They moved us further away from direct experience and towards a more mediated, systematized way of interacting with the world.
It's like we've built a world that mirrors the left hemisphere's preferences, a world obsessed with efficiency, productivity, and quantifiable results. But you mentioned that this might be making us uncomfortable. How so?
Well, think about it. Have you ever felt like life is just a series of tasks to be checked off a list, that your value is measured by your output, your productivity?
I think a lot of us can relate to that feeling.
This is one of the potential downsides of a left hemisphere dominant world. We risk becoming alienated from ourselves, from each other, and from the natural world.
So in our pursuit of progress in building a more efficient and technologically advanced society, have we lost sight of something essential? Are we missing those things that the right hemisphere values connection, meaning a sense of wholeness?
That's a question McGilchrist wants us to grapple with. But he doesn't leave us completely in despair. He sees a potential counterbalance, a way to reclaim some of that lost wisdom. And that brings us to our next point, art and the right hemisphere, a counterbalance.
Art to the rescue.
Ah,
This is where things get a bit more hopeful, right?
exactly. McGilchrist sees art as a powerful expression of the right hemisphere's way of being. Art doesn't try to categorize or explain. It embraces ambiguity, emotional depth, the experience of time and space, and the connection to the body.
So art speaks a language that the left brain can't fully grasp.
Think about standing in front of an abstract painting. Your left brain might try to impose meaning to analyze the shapes and colors, but the right brain allows you to simply experience it, to feel its impact without the need for words.
That makes sense. And it's not just visual art, right? Music, poetry, dance. All of these forms of expression seem to bypass the left brain's need for control and tap into something deeper.
Precisely. And here's a fascinating point that McGilchrist makes. He points out that even language itself originated in the right hemisphere. It was initially rooted in music, in that emotional embodied connection. So even the tool that the left hemisphere seems to have co-opted for its own purposes, even language has its roots in this more holistic way of being in the world.
So art can help us bridge that gap, between these two worlds within our minds, reconnect with the wisdom of the right hemisphere. But this idea of necessary ignorance we touched on earlier, that each hemisphere needs its own space to operate effectively. I'm curious to explore that further.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point, and it gets to the heart of why simply strengthening the right hemisphere isn't the whole solution. A healthy brain, it needs both differentiation and integration. Imagine a team of expert architects designing a complex structure. You have specialists in structural engineering and sustainable design and aesthetics. Each of them needs to work independently to, bring their expertise to the table. But if they never collaborate, if they remain completely ignorant of each other's work, the project's going to be a disaster.
Yeah, that's such a clear analogy. So how does this apply to our own brains?
Well, think about those moments when you're intensely focused, when you're deeply engrossed in a task, maybe solving a complex problem, writing a piece of code, and even just losing yourself in a good book. That's your left hemisphere in its element. It's, building its intricate systems, creating its maps of meaning. If the right hemisphere were constantly interrupting, pointing out all the exceptions, the nuances, the things that don't quite fit the model, you'd never get anything done.
It's like trying to write a novel with someone constantly whispering in your ear, but what about this? Have you considered that? You'd never finish a sentence.
Exactly. But on the flip side, if the left hemisphere were allowed to dominate completely, we'd end up with a world that's, perfectly ordered, perfectly efficient, but devoid of meaning, depth connection. Imagine a city designed solely for functionality with no parks, no art, no spaces for, spontaneous interaction, it would be a sterile and ultimately soul-crushing place to live.
That's a chilling thought. So the key is finding that balance, allowing each hemisphere to do what it does best while also fostering, a healthy dialogue between them. But how do we do that, in a world that seems to constantly push us towards left brain dominance?
That is the million-dollar question. I mean, Gilchrist doesn't, offer any easy answers or quick fixes. He's not advocating for a complete rejection of the left hemisphere or, retreat into some right-brained utopia. It's about awareness.
Yeah.
It's about making conscious choices that nourish both hemispheres.
So it's about more than just appreciating art or spending time in nature.
Oh, absolutely. Those are great starting points. But it's also about cultivating a mindset of curiosity, openness, a willingness to embrace ambiguity. It's about noticing those moments when the left brain is starting to dominate and, consciously inviting the right brain back into the conversation.
So it's about cultivating a more mindful approach to life, being present in our bodies, in our experiences, and in our interactions with the world around us.
You're getting it. It's about recognizing that we're not just, thinking machines,
Yeah.
but feeling, sensing, embodied beings who are deeply interconnected with everything around us.
That's a really powerful thought. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the divided brain, what are some key takeaways you'd like to leave with our listener?
I think the most important takeaway is that we have a choice. We can choose to let the left hemisphere's drive for, control and certainty dominate our lives, or we can consciously cultivate those qualities that the right hemisphere embodies. Empathy, creativity, a sense of wonder, an appreciation for the interconnectedness of all things.
It's empowering to think that we're not just passengers on this journey. We have agency. We can choose to shape our own experience of the world, and in doing so, maybe even contribute to shaping a more balanced and humane future.
Well said. And remember, this deep dive has just scratched the surface of McGilchrist's work. If you're intrigued by these ideas, I highly encourage you to explore his book, The Master and His Emissary, for a richer and deeper understanding.
This has been such a fascinating exploration. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of how my own mind works and the incredible potential that lies within each hemisphere.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you. And to our listener, may this exploration inspire you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep cultivating that beautiful dance between the two hemispheres of your own amazing brain.
Until next time, keep those hemispheres humming.